Good morning. In class today we talked about how the Israelites were told to remember the Shema. Remember, and how effective they are at teaching their children to remember the Shema. In the 22nd chapter of Luke, Christ is having his Last Supper. They're celebrating the Passover. And he takes the bread and he gives thanks. And he says, "Do this in remembrance of me." So today, do you remember Jesus? And when you remember Jesus, what do you see? Do you remember a baby Jesus, born of a virgin, placed in a manger? Do you remember a Jesus who stayed behind at the temple and got mama and daddy worried? Do you remember Jesus as a powerful worker of miracles? Do you remember that he could heal the sick with the touch or a word? Do you remember that he could calm a storm? Do you remember Jesus as a great teacher who sat on a mountainside and gave a sermon that lasts through eternity? Do you remember Jesus? Do you remember Jesus as suffering on a cross? A body given and broken and bleeding for you. Do you remember that Jesus? Do you remember Jesus resurrected from the dead? An empty tomb. Do you remember that Jesus? Do you remember the Jesus that ascended right in front of his apostles? His disciples watched him ascend to heaven with their mouths agape. What is happening? Is that the Jesus you remember? Because they're all true. But I want to share with you today the Jesus you are going to see. Because he's not broken. He's not bleeding. He's not a baby in a manger. The Jesus you are going to see is revealed to us in Revelation chapter 2. I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me. And when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe, reaching down to his feet, with a golden sash around his chest. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in the furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp, double-edged sword. His face was like the sun, shining in all its brilliance. And when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and Hades." When we remember Jesus, remember the Jesus you're going to see. The King of all kings, the Lord of lords, the name above every name. That's the Jesus we're here to remember this day.